Welcome to the Art Museum, created by Rachel,
Leslie.
and me, Sarah.
Today we will be discussing the cause of the development of U.S. slavery in the years 1607 to 1750.
Hope you enjoy.
This art piece is titled The Middle Passage. All on board were individuals who wanted a new life in the New World, so they pledged a number of years of service in return for this opportunity. However, this trip to the New World was not a dream. In this art piece, the boat demonstrates how crowded and overpopulated the passage was. There was no room to sleep, and they roughly only had a space of 2 feet in width and 6 feet in length. The rib cage shown represents the malnourishment these indentured servants faced. They were rarely given food and were only served about 3 times a week. Many died of diseases, as illustrated in the grave. Due to the lack of food and medicine, many were not given the proper care and attention that was needed. One major factor in the production of these diseases was the lack of fresh air. The rooms the African Americans were kept in were notoriously hot, which would cause fevers and fluxes, which killed several. Lastly, most times, male African Americans that were brought on the ship were fastened with handcuffs on their wrists and irons were riveted on their legs. They were brutally beaten if they were to disobey, and in severe instances were beaten to death.
When African Americans arrived to the colonies, they were often placed into slave markets or slave auctions, represented by this image. Here, white colonists were able to carefully examine the African Americans and purchase them. They would then have to serve as slaves, with no promise of freedom. The interest of slaves began to grow as the use of indentured servants began to decline. White colonists saw African Americans as a form of free labor. Children usually were separated from their families as well.
This piece demonstrates few examples on what slaves were not allowed to do. For instance, slaves were allowed to be baptized, but it did not free them of their servitude. Slaves were also not allowed to marry any white person and vice versa, which is why interracial marriages were banned during those times. Slaves also had no right to liberty or freedom, and were to serve for the rest of their lives, similar to the saying, "Until death do us part." Lastly, all offspring of an African American woman were to be slaves. Slavery was generational. There was no new opportunity for their children and families.
Next, we have this canvas drawing here. On the top of the drawing, this is a representation of African Americans beginning to escape from their owners in slavery. Many families began escaping because they were seeking a better life and better opportunities for themselves and their families, along with generations to continue. They would attempt the escape during the night because it gave them a better chance to not get caught. They were taking a big risk because if they were to get caught, they would get beat to death. The hands are representing that although the African Americans ran away, the whites were always searching for them and would put out signs of wanted and rewarded if found to have groups looking for them. Then we have the bottom half of the drawing. This is a representation of the African Americans coming together to stand up for themselves. There was an uprising and riots because the African Americans began to rebel against slavery. They wanted there to be acts of freedom, liberty, rights, and equality for them. They fought together against the whites to try and end slavery.